Hey guys, welcome back to another night of mild historical insomnia. So dim the lights, grab whatever lukewarm beverage you're currently tolerating, and settle in. Tonight, we're wandering through the slow, weird, and sometimes beautiful evolution of New York's architecture, from a swampy Dutch outpost to a skyline that now looks like someone tried to play Tetris with glass. We're not chasing excitement here. We're just drifting through centuries of bricks, egos, and questionable design decisions. You know, the relaxing kind of chaos. The Dutch begin it all. 1609, 1664. Our story begins, as so many bad real estate ventures do, with the Dutch. In 1609, Henry Hudson, working for the Dutch East India Company, sailed up what is now called the Hudson River, looked around, and decided this was prime trading territory. Which, to be fair, meant swampy land, unpredictable weather, and locals who didn't particularly want him there. By 1624, Dutch settlers had arrived and founded New Amsterdam, which is basically Manhattan before it had opinions. The architecture. Think muddy wooden houses, small trading posts, and whatever passed as cute in the 17th century when half your town was a pig pen. The first buildings were what historians politely call vernacular Dutch. That means, in practice, we had some timber, some nails, and no real plan. Houses were typically 1 or 2 stories, steep gable roofs so snow would slide off, and small windows to avoid the horrors of winter winds. Everything looked like a countryside village someone accidentally dropped on an island. Of course, because it was the 1600s, everyone was also mildly paranoid about being invaded, so walls were built, wooden palisades, giving us what would one day become Wall Street. Yep, the world's financial center is literally named after a wooden fence. Somehow that feels poetically accurate. Inside these early houses, the Dutch used brick in the chimneys, one of the few signs of permanence. The rest was rough timber, and the interiors were small, dark, and probably smelled like salted fish and regret. By the 1640s, as the settlement grew, the Dutch began importing more bricks and craftsmen from home, and little by little gabled facades started to appear. They were these charming step-gabled roofs, like staircases for pigeons, which you can still see echoes of in a few surviving old buildings downtown. Then came 1664. The English showed up, shrugged, and said, "This is ours now." They renamed it New York after the Duke of York because apparently originality was too much effort. Houses the English make it respectable. 1664, 1776. So now the city starts to look a bit more English. The gables get flatter, the symmetry increases. Everyone starts pretending to have taste. The English brought Georgian architecture, which was big on proportion, order, and the illusion of sophistication. You've seen it before. Rows of tidy brick townhouses, white trim, evenly spaced windows, the architectural equivalent of a tight-laced corset. Most of these homes were 2 or 3 stories tall, with brick facades and sash windows. Inside, there were paneled walls, staircases that creaked like they were complaining, and fireplaces in every room because central heating was still a fantasy. St. Paul's Chapel, finished in 1766, is one of the few Georgian gems still standing in Lower Manhattan. It's calm, elegant, and quietly smug about having survived both the Great Fire of 1776 and multiple centuries of rent hikes. Speaking of that fire, yes, in September 1776, much of New York City burned down. Because of course it did. The Revolutionary War was happening, everyone was stressed, and half the town was made of wood. The fire wiped out hundreds of buildings, and suddenly everyone had to rebuild again. This was when brick became less of a style choice and more of a survival strategy. It resisted fire a little better, and by then, importing brick was easier thanks to improved shipping. So Georgian-style brick homes popped up like neat little Lego blocks all over Lower Manhattan. Still, by 1776, the city was far from glamorous. Muddy streets, overcrowded housing, and that special smell of horse manure and open sewage gave it an ambience that no amount of symmetry could fix. Bricks the federal style, 1,780–1,830. After independence, New York started trying to look like a capital, or at least like it could host dinner without embarrassment. Enter the federal style, which was basically Georgian architecture that had learned to relax a little. Think thinner details, lighter colors, and these lovely curved fan lights above doors that screamed, "We are a democracy," but still fancy. Federal-style homes were popular among merchants and the early upper-middle class, people who made their fortunes in trade, banking, or anything that could be politely described as not too parady. If you wander around today, the South Street Seaport area gives a good idea of what early 19th century New York looked like. Simple brick buildings, narrow streets, and enough charm to make you forget how many rats probably lived there back then. The interiors were modest but proud. High ceilings, simple fireplaces, decorative moldings, and those iconic spiral staircases that look elegant but feel like punishment if you have groceries. At the same time, public buildings were starting to make statements. City Hall, completed in 1812, mixed federal and French influences with its white marble facade and neat proportions. It was the city's way of saying, "We're not London, but we're trying." Of course, the population was growing faster than the architects could sketch, so housing spilled northward. By the 1820s, developers were laying out entire streets of nearly identical row houses, a pattern that would haunt New York for centuries to come. Luggage the brownstone boom, 1830, 1870. Now here, where things start to look familiar, or at least Instagrammable. By the mid-19th century, New York had become the entry point for millions of immigrants. The city exploded in size, wealth, and ego. The rich wanted elegance, the poor wanted a roof, and the middle class wanted to pretend they were rich. Enter the brownstone. Brownstone wasn't just a color. It was a type of sandstone quarried in New Jersey and Connecticut. It was cheap, easy to carve, and gave houses that warm, chocolatey look that says, "I'm respectable but not too rich." Rows and rows of these stoop-fronted homes filled neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, the Upper West Side, and Brooklyn's Park Slope. Each was narrow but tall 4 or 5 stories stacked vertically, because apparently stairs were cheaper than land. Architecturally, they were influenced by the Italianate and Greek Revival styles. That meant tall windows, ornate door frames, and iron railings that looked pretty but were hell in winter. The stoop, that signature New York feature, wasn't just aesthetic. It helped lift the main living floor above the street, useful in a city that liked to flood, spill, and generally misbehave. The stoop also became a social space. People sat outside, gossiped, watched life go by, an early form of passive entertainment before Netflix existed. Inside, brownstones were long and narrow, with parlors, dining rooms, and high ceilings. Decorative plasterwork everywhere. The wealthy installed marble fireplaces, everyone else just painted things white and called it minimalism. Of course, with all this elegance came overcrowding. Immigrants poured in by the hundreds of thousands, and soon, many brownstones were chopped into tenements. One house might hold 5 families, and privacy became as mythical as clean air. Office building the birth of the high-rise, 1870–1900. By the late 19th century, the skyline was starting to grow vertically. New York, being perpetually short on space and patience, decided that up was the new out. The invention of the elevator in the 1850s, combined with the arrival of steel frame construction, made it possible to build taller, safer buildings. Architects like George B. Post and Richard Morris Hunt embraced the possibilities. One of the early marvels was the Equitable Life Building, 1870, which stood 7 stories high and was considered enormous. 7. That's right, by modern standards. It's like calling a loaf of bread a skyscraper. But for its time, it was revolutionary. Then came the Flatiron Building in 1902, an elegant wedge of steel and stone that made everyone stop and stare, partly in awe, partly in confusion. People said it looked like a giant clothes iron, which, yes, is how it got its name. It was one of the first buildings to truly shape the city's image, tall, bold, and slightly impractical. Architectural styles during this period were all over the place. Beaux Arts was the rage for grand public buildings, heavy ornamentation, classical columns, and more stone lions than necessary. The New York Public Library, completed in 1911, is a perfect example. It looks like a Roman temple that got lost and decided to stay. Meanwhile, commercial buildings mixed Romanesque, Renaissance, and Gothic revival styles, often in the same block. The result? A kind of architectural buffet, everything piled together and somehow still delicious. Metro underground and overhead. Infrastructure as architecture. Architecture isn't just about pretty facades. It's also about what you don't see, or what you try not to smell. In 1904, the New York City subway opened. It was a triumph of engineering and questionable air quality. The stations featured ceramic tile mosaics and vaulted ceilings, and for many New Yorkers, it was their first exposure to underground art that wasn't graffiti. Above ground, the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, became an icon of 19th-century optimism, a Gothic revival masterpiece of cables and stone towers that looked both delicate and indestructible. It connected Manhattan and Brooklyn long before Brooklyn became a place where people discussed cold brew as philosophy. Cityscape the city takes shape, early 20th century. As the 1900s rolled in, so did the skyscrapers, and the competition to make each one taller, shinier, and more absurdly expensive. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, was called the Cathedral of Commerce. It was 792 feet tall, covered in ornate terracotta detail, and looked like a Gothic church that decided to start selling insurance. Then came the Chrysler Building in 1930, Art Deco perfection. Stainless steel spire, sunburst motifs, and gargoyles shaped like car ornaments. It's flashy, elegant, and somehow humble enough to still feel human. A year later, the Empire State Building took the crown. 1,250 feet of limestone, steel, and pure Great Depression-era optimism. Built in just over a year, it became the most famous building in the world, and briefly, the tallest. It also became the world's most photogenic lightning rod, which is quite a career. By now, Manhattan's skyline was less a cityscape and more an architectural arms race. Everyone wanted height, prestige, and that perfect spot where the light hit just right at sunset, long before Instagram demanded it. If you made it through the Brownstones and the Empire State, congrats, you've officially survived pre-modern New York. Now pour another cup of whatever keeps you awake yet somehow soothes you, because tonight we're gliding into the modern era, that elegant stretch of time when architects collectively said, you know what? Maybe decoration is overrated. We're talking about the mid-1900s, the decades when function became the new beauty, and the city's skyline started to resemble an open laptop screen. Shiny, rectangular, and slightly depressing. The rise of the glass box, 1950s, 1970s. By the 1950s, New York was booming again. War was over. Money was flowing. Everyone wore gray suits and said things like efficiency without irony. Architects followed suit, giving the world what's known as the international style, a phrase that basically means less is more and we're serious about it. This movement had started in Europe, of course, with figures like Le Corbusier and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe preaching the gospel of minimalism. America, as usual, imported the trend and then supersized it. Mies van der Rohe himself designed one of New York's defining modernist towers, the Seagram Building, completed in 1958 on Park Avenue. Bronze-tinted glass, steel frame, and a plaza that actually left space. In the middle of Manhattan. The building was so refined it made the older stone towers look like they'd overdressed for the occasion. Inside, everything was sleek and severe, marble, glass, leather, and right angles. No frills, no cornices, no cherubs, just pure geometry. It was meant to symbolize modern corporate virtue, though mostly it just whispered, "Our air conditioning is better than yours." The Seagram's success launched 1,000 imitators. Soon, Park Avenue was lined with reflective slabs of steel and glass. The Lever House, built a few years earlier in 1952, was already experimenting with the same idea, a glass curtain wall suspended over a plaza, like a giant mirror politely hovering above pedestrians. Of course, critics complained that all these new towers made the city feel sterile. Gone were the flourishes of Beaux Arts grandeur. Everything now looked like a giant filing cabinet, but developers loved it. Glass was cheap, light, and modern, and tenants could brag about being forward-thinking. And thus began the era of the glass box, efficient, emotionless, and endlessly duplicable. Office building the brutalist detour, 1960s, 1980s. But not everyone wanted to live in a transparent rectangle. Some architects, perhaps tired of all the smooth surfaces, decided that buildings should feel heavy, monumental, and vaguely intimidating. Enter brutalism, from the French bête en brute, meaning raw concrete. It sounds better in French, like most difficult things. In New York, this style arrived in the 1960s and stayed through the 1980s like an architectural hangover. Buildings like the Whitney Museum of American Art, 1966, designed by Marcel Breuer, embodied the trend, a massive, upside-down pyramid of concrete and stone that looked like a fortress built to repel feelings. People either loved or hated brutalism, mostly hated, at least at the time. It was unapologetically rough, all sharp angles and blocky shadows. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, also brutalist, looked like a Lego prison that forgot to be fun. Still, brutalism wasn't trying to be beautiful. It was trying to be honest, showing the raw materials, the structure, the bones of the building. In a way, it was New York at its most self-reflective, strong, cold, a little bit lonely. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, completed in 1969, softened the mood a bit. It mixed monumental modernism with marble facades and giant columns, sort of a brutalist-light experience, perfect for people who wanted modernism without the existential dread. Cityscape at dusk, the skyscraper race continues. 1970s, 1990s. You'd think after the Empire State, people might calm down. But New York, as always, said, "Let's build higher." By the early 1970s, architects were pushing technology to new limits. The skyline was expanding both upward and outward, and nothing symbolized that ambition more than the World Trade Center. Designed by Minoru Yamasaki and completed in 1973, the Twin Towers were 110 stories each, simple, reflective, and impossibly tall. Their design used lightweight steel framing, allowing for massive interior floors without columns. It was engineering poetry, written in Helvetica. Many people thought they looked bland, just two rectangles stabbing the sky, but they were pure modernism distilled. No ornament, no ego, just sheer scale. The plaza beneath them, though windswept and austere, felt like a cathedral of capitalism. The World Trade Center complex defined the city's skyline for 3 decades, until its destruction in 2001. An event too heavy for our sleepy tone, but one that permanently changed how the city thought about architecture, safety, and symbolism. Meanwhile, the 1980s were a bit more playful. After years of strict minimalism, architects rediscovered color, curves, and irony. Enter postmodernism. Cyclone postmodern playtime, 1980s, 1990s. If modernism was all business, postmodernism was that coworker who suddenly starts wearing neon and quoting philosophy. Architects like Philip Johnson, who had once worshipped at the altar of glass boxes, started adding decorative elements again, pediments, arches, even jokes. His AT&T building, completed 1984, now 550 Madison Avenue, looked like a skyscraper wearing a Chippendale cabinet on its head. People called it ridiculous. Others called it genius. Either way, it had personality, something New York hadn't seen in decades. This era produced some wonderfully weird hybrids. Office towers with granite facades, colorful stripes, and references to classical forms that didn't quite fit but refused to apologize. The idea was to reintroduce emotion into architecture, even if that emotion was confusion. Public buildings followed suit. The New York State Theater at Lincoln Center added bold decorative gestures. Residential towers flirted with Art Deco revival details. It was as if the city had collectively remembered that architecture could be fun, not just functional. Cityscape, the Skyline Reimagined. 2000s present. And now we float into the 21st century, the era of starchitects, computer-generated curves, and glass so reflective you can see your existential crisis in it. After the trauma of 9/11, architecture in New York became not just about height, but about meaning. The new World Trade Center complex emerged as both memorial and rebirth. The centerpiece, One World Trade Center, completed 2014, rises 1,776 feet, an intentional nod to American independence. Designed by David Childs, it combines symbolism with practicality, a sleek glass form that tapers upward like a crystalline flame. Nearby, the Oculus, designed by Santiago Calatrava, became the city's new architectural selfie spot, a soaring white ribcage of steel that looks vaguely like a bird mid-flight or a futuristic skeleton, depending on your mood. It's technically a transit hub, but mostly it's where tourists go to feel small and overexposed. At the same time, luxury residential towers began sprouting along 57th Street, nicknamed Billionaires Row. These are the super-slender skyscrapers, impossibly thin needles of glass that seem to defy physics and good taste. Buildings like 432 Park Avenue, 2015, and Central Park Tower, 2020, dominate the skyline, each trying to out-minimalize the next. They're feats of engineering and symbols of economic inequality that literally cast shadows over Central Park. You can almost hear the city sighing under their weight. Elsewhere, redevelopment projects reshaped entire neighborhoods. The High Line, opened in 2009, turned an abandoned elevated railway into a park in the sky, part landscape, part art installation. It also triggered a wave of glossy developments around it, including Zaha Hadid's fluid, curving apartment building at 520 West 28th Street. Downtown, the Hudson Yards complex went full sci-fi, with mirrored towers, sculptural staircases, and the now famous vessel. A honeycomb of stairs to nowhere that was supposed to be interactive art, but mostly functions as an expensive backdrop for selfies. New York's architecture today is a patchwork of eras, Dutch stoops beside Beaux-Arts banks beside futuristic glass shards. It's messy, contradictory, and utterly alive. Themes that never chain. If you zoom out, metaphorically, not in Google Maps, New York's architecture tells one long story about ambition. Every generation wants to build higher, cleaner, or stranger. Each style rebels against the last. The Dutch built low and crooked. The English made things symmetrical. The Victorians went ornate. The modernists wiped the slate clean. The postmodernists scribbled on it again. Even now, as sustainability becomes the new mantra, architects are rethinking what modern means. Glass towers are getting greener, literally and figuratively, with solar panels, green roofs, and recycled materials. The city's older buildings are being restored rather than replaced, giving history a new lease on life. It's a rare kind of continuity, old bricks meeting new pixels. Crescent moon, drifting toward the skyline. So if you're lying there right now, maybe half awake, picturing the city lights from above, remember that every one of those lights sits in a building shaped by centuries of ambition, compromise, and questionable taste. From the Dutch traders, muddy huts to today's billion-dollar spires, New York has never really stopped building. It's a city in constant renovation, not just of its skyline, but of its identity. Maybe that's why they call it the city that never sleeps, because even its buildings are always trying to outdo one another, one floor at a time. By now, you've been gently floated across centuries of facades, spires, and skyscrapers. Now it's time to step inside, literally, and see how people actually inhabited these structures. Because architecture isn't just about the outside, it's about how humans jam themselves into it, make messes, and sometimes flourish quietly in unexpected ways. So dim the lights a little further. Imagine walking through creaky doors, marble lobbies, narrow hallways, and endless flights of stairs. This is New York, lived in and imperfect. Derelict early tenements, 19th century crowding. Let's float back to the mid-1800s, when the city's population exploded and developers realized that one building could host as many human beings as legally possible. Enter the tenement. These were not charming brownstones for Instagram. They were often converted or purpose-built structures with narrow rooms, shared toilets, and ventilation that could politely be called optimistic. The typical tenement was 5 or 6 stories of tightly stacked apartments. Families of 5 or 6 lived in single rooms, and privacy was, as you might expect, optional. Kitchens were tiny, often just a stove in the corner, and windows looked directly into other windows, giving rise to the early art of passive-aggressive stares at neighbors. By 1879, the Tenement House Act attempted to improve living conditions. Windows, fire escapes, and slightly less horrific sanitation were mandated, but developers found clever ways around it. Some buildings had light wells so narrow you could toss a tennis ball and hit both sides. And ventilation shafts. Well, let's just say that airflow sometimes meant the scent of someone else's dinner drifting directly into your bedroom. Still, these tenements were communities. Despite the crowding, life persisted. Children played in the streets, families cooked together, and new immigrants created networks of support, often around food stalls, laundries, and shared advice about which landlord to avoid. House with garden brownstones as family theaters. Meanwhile, in the brownstone neighborhoods we discussed earlier, life was equally structured but slightly more spacious. A typical middle-class brownstone apartment had a parlor floor, which was the showpiece. Families only used it when entertaining, because it was too precious to risk. Guests would sit on stiff furniture, admire decorative plasterwork, and maybe be offered tea in tiny porcelain cups, all while the family's daily life unfolded elsewhere in quieter, less Instagrammable rooms. The stoop became a social stage. People didn't just use it to enter the house. They sat there, observed street life, and occasionally judged neighbors in a way that was subtle yet extremely effective. Inside, rooms were stacked vertically. Bedrooms upstairs, kitchen below, and servants' quarters, if the family had servants, often tucked somewhere that felt like a secret annex. Staircases creaked under the weight of gossip, laundry, and occasionally the family dog. By the 20th century, brownstones were sometimes converted into multiple apartments, making them more accessible to the growing middle class. They retained charm, but the intimacy of a single-family home slowly faded. Office building luxury apartments, and the rise of the high-rise lifestyle. As the 20th century rolled in, high-rise apartments became more desirable, especially along Central Park, Fifth Avenue, and other upscale neighborhoods. These early luxury apartments were elegant but intimidating. Ceilings were high, hallways long, and everything designed to impress without actually inviting you to sit down. Landlords were keen on exclusivity. Some apartments didn't have kitchens because the assumption was that residents would eat out or employ staff. Elevators were staffed for decades. Imagine a man in a uniform waiting to politely escort you up, ensuring you didn't press the wrong button or mingle with the riffraff. It was a form of architectural social control. Inside, apartments featured large formal dining rooms, libraries, and parlors. The interiors were sometimes more ostentatious than the exteriors: silk wallpaper, marble fireplaces, ornate moldings. Kitchens and bathrooms, however, were modest, hidden away as if utility spaces were embarrassing secrets. The loft and industrial conversion. By the mid-20th century, the city's industrial zones had started to empty. Factories, warehouses, and printing plants sat largely unused as manufacturing declined. Artists, always on the lookout for cheap space with interesting light, began converting these industrial buildings into lofts. Lofts were revolutionary for a sleepy city obsessed with compartmentalization. High ceilings, exposed beams, large windows, and open layouts allowed creativity to thrive, or at least, to be photographed for magazines. In these spaces, life became experimental. Some lofts were simultaneously studio and home. Others were semi-communal. One could nap beneath a skylight, paint in the middle of the room, and host dinner parties in a corner previously reserved for packing crates. Lofts also helped reshape neighborhoods. Soho, once a warehouse district, slowly became a playground for artists, bohemians, and eventually, anyone with enough money to call themselves cultured. Sunset the 21st century. Luxury, glass, and tiny spaces. Now let's drift gently into today's interiors. Modern New York apartments can be extreme exercises in contradiction. On one hand, luxury condos tower over Central Park and Billionaires Row, often spanning multiple floors, with private elevators, sprawling kitchens, and terraces that overlook the city like a landscape painting. These spaces are meticulously designed, polished, and if we're honest, slightly intimidating. On the other hand, there's the reality of tiny apartments squeezed into older buildings or microunits in new developments. Tenants inhabit spaces barely large enough to swing a cat, much less furniture. Everything is compact, multifunctional, and cleverly disguised. Beds fold into walls, kitchens are pared down to essentials, and bathrooms feel like airplane cabins with ambition. Yet even in these tiny spaces, New Yorkers adapt. Furniture is chosen for flexibility. Every shelf, nook, and cranny is claimed. Verticality is embraced: bunk beds, lofted workspaces, and stacked storage. The interior world of the city mirrors its skyline. Every inch is used, every opportunity maximized, and privacy is sometimes negotiable. Couch life in common spaces. High-rise living also created shared interior experiences. Lobbies became stages, gyms became social arenas, and rooftop terraces were the city's answer to a backyard. Condominiums and co-ops often regulate even the smallest behaviors, from renovations to window treatments, ensuring that life inside is as curated as life outside. Even public spaces inside buildings have a personality. Consider the Chrysler Building lobby: Art Deco elegance, marble floors, and an interior that feels like a jewelry box. Or the Seagram Building lobby, with its minimalist calm, polished bronze, and those famous Mies van der Rohe benches, designed to impress, but also to make you wonder if you really deserve to sit there. In older apartment buildings, shared hallways often became micro-neighborhoods. People exchanged pleasantries, borrowed sugar, or quietly judged each other, a gentle social architecture built into the design. Themes of interior life. Stepping back, there are a few patterns in how New Yorkers inhabit space. Verticality. Life is stacked, literally. Families, rooms, and functions pile upward. Adaptation. Tiny spaces force creativity, from multifunctional furniture to reimagined lofts. Social performance. Interiors are designed for visibility, whether to impress guests, neighbors, or the occasional critic. Community. Even in minimal or industrial spaces, people find ways to connect: hallways, stoops, shared courtyards, and communal rooftops. Essentially, New Yorkers live like their buildings: tall, crowded, occasionally cold, but full of surprises tucked into hidden corners. Crescent moon, wrapping up the domestic drift. So if you're lying in bed, imagining the city outside your window, all those towers, brownstones, lofts, and condominiums, remember that each building carries centuries of life, adaptation, and quiet storytelling. New Yorkers have always squeezed themselves into spaces, negotiated comfort with creativity, and transformed bricks and steel into homes. The exteriors may grab the eye, but it's the interiors, the lived-in, private, sometimes chaotic interiors, that truly reflect the soul of the city. The skyline is impressive, but the small apartments, shared hallways, and quirky lofts,